works or used to work at the University of Wisconsin. I think he's happily retired now. By the look of his smile, he is. He has been also very much part of ISO's, originally the PC251, now TC251. So basically the committee that actually runs the ISO management suite of standards, ISO 55000. And he is a director at the IAM US. Myself, I work at Copperleaf in Canada. I am also a member of TC251, of course, and I'm currently on the board of the IAM, which just finished actually just a few minutes ago, the latest board meeting. And our presenters today, Blair actually is going to do the honors and kind of tell us a bit more. But we have Blair, I think without an E actually. I think that's an extra E that you got for free there, Blair.
That's right.
And then Dan Hendrickson, of course, of the Port of Virginia. So further introductions will follow. So with that, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Blair.
Thanks, Berto. And let me pull up our presentation. Give me a moment. Okay. Just gonna get a confirmation that folks can see their PowerPoint up.
Full screen. Okay, put it in full screen.
Got a moment to load up. Are we good in full screen?
We're good.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Tom and Bodwin for hosting this webinar, and thank you to Joe for the communications, getting the message out, and thank you again to the IAM North America chapter for giving Dan and I another opportunity to talk about asset management at the Port of Virginia. So as Bodwin mentioned, I'm Blair Trame. I'm a director with KPMG US's Infrastructure Advisory Group, and I'm joined again by Dan Hendrickson, the Vice President for Asset Management and Special Projects at the Port of Virginia. So today's agenda, pretty lean agenda. We're going to talk about strategic asset management planning at the Port of Virginia. We're going to talk about, how Dan and I think the approach to strategic asset management planning and the SAMP at the port is a little different and tailored to meet the port's needs. So we'll share a bit on that case study. We'll talk about the benefits that the port has realized for taking this approach to its asset management framework and its SAMP, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So as I mentioned, it's a pretty lean agenda, so we'll pause a few times as we go through our presentation materials to take a few questions, and then we'll leave ample time at the end to cover questions, and absolutely welcome any further questions offline. So want to start by talking about the asset management journey at the Port of Virginia. So to put some time scales on this here, really it started in January of 2019 when the port employed my group at KPMG to help them with the diagnostic maturity assessment of their asset management capabilities and practices. So through that spring of 2019, developed an asset management implementation roadmap. Dan's going to walk you through some of the myriad of things that the Port of Virginia has done to implement that implementation roadmap. But just want to mention some of the other opportunities Dan and I have had to talk to, hopefully many of you, afforded to us by the Institute of Asset Management. So we've done 2 webinars to date. First on the asset management leadership and governance structure at the port, and an overview of the SAMP. We did 2 presentations at the last fall's IAM North America conference, where we talked again about the SAMP and how it will be used and how crucial it is to implementing the port's carbon zero strategy. And then the port was fortunate enough to have its Chief Operating Officer, Joe Ruddy, give one of the keynote addresses on to share on the port's carbon zero strategy and again their plan and on implementing it. And here we are today to again talk about asset management. So Dan and I are quite proud of the progress that Port of Virginia has made in its asset management journey, and is, I think we can say confidently, without being too arrogant, that it's it's near the top in the ports and maritime industry. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to walk you through the various steps and progress that the port's made in its asset management journey.
All right, thank you. And so as Blair said, in 2019, he came and helped lead a team that did a initial assessment of the port to develop our roadmap. As it was without anyone kind of at the port who was designated as the person to lead the effort, it was actually several months after they finished and were trying to schedule the outbrief and discussion with the roadmap before the port actually had them back to give it. At that point, realizing the importance of the effort, I volunteered to make it my primary job for the next several years to execute asset management, bring them back. And I think that was one of our first lessons learned in this process was without a person whose job it is to do this, it will wither. It can't be a second or third task added on if it doesn't get the primary focus at sufficient of enough level within the organization. It kind of will pause. And as I've talked to other people over the years that I've been in this, that seems to be a common theme. A lot of people want to do it. A lot of people have been assigned it, but they have a day job and it just keeps lagging and lagging and lagging, as opposed to saying, all right, this is my day job. I'm going to make sure it gets done. I'm going to meet with everybody weekly, monthly to keep pushing it along. So we started with overall developing our principles. What do we want to get out of the program? The roadmap showed all the areas where we knew we were deficient, but we needed we had a corporate strategy, we had some overall corporate values. So how can we take those corporate values, translate them into the purpose of asset management? By being able to tie back to our corporate values, it made asset management kind of a very clear follow-on as we discussed it throughout the organization, explained why we're doing it. To meet some of our values, such as sustainability, to meet some of our goals of financial responsibility, we needed asset management, and the principles helped tie that together. So in the first year, we developed the first round of our strategic asset management plan, codifying the principles and looking at how those are actually going to be implemented in an asset management plan. With that, we had the first two kind of follow-on chapters of asset management plans. The port broke up our collection of assets into, I think it was 8 different groups. And we started with those that turn over the most frequently, figuring our IT assets, which a 3 to 5 year life cycle, those are the most critical to understand because we'll be buying them most frequently. Our vehicles, such as pickup trucks and forklifts, which have an 8-ish year lifespan, also were our quick turnover assets. And we worked our way up through our smaller cranes, our large cranes, our very large cranes, and then our civil infrastructure and our buildings. We were kind of we wanted a systematic manner of going through all of our assets. So in phase 2, we took the first 2 chapters of the asset management plans to attach to the strategic asset management plan, IT and vehicles. We also used that time looking at vehicles to establish some proof of concepts of how it could work on those quick turnover assets. We looked at pickup trucks as one of our first ones. The port has over 400 pickup trucks in our inventory. And that's 400 light pickup trucks. If you include our heavy duty trucks, our buses, and our other vehicles, it was over 700 vehicles in the fleet. But 400 light pickup trucks, which were almost commodities. So we looked at different environmental concerns, made in America concerns, safety, repairability, how well we could use those trucks within our current unionized maintenance structure, and set up a proof of concept of how we wanted to make future asset decisions, not just letting maintenance pick what they wanted or letting ops pick what they wanted, or just procurement go get us a cheap truck. We wanted to have, and we'll go in a little bit later, who all was in our asset management governance. But we wanted to make sure everyone throughout the organization bought into not a just simplistic decision-making framework, but a more regimented decision-making framework, looking at all facets that will matter to us in asset decision-making. And pickup trucks are surprisingly emotional within the organization, despite that they're $25,000, and we also buy $12 million cranes, and we just got our board approval for a $500 million construction project. That $500 million construction project does not get nearly as much discussion as the pickup trucks. So it was both a commodity purchase, but also one that was deeply felt throughout the organization. And it was one where we critically needed help. I think when Blair came in and helped us go through the maintenance costs, we discovered our one facility was spending almost $7,000 per year per truck in maintenance. We had no life cycle plan. Our maintenance group was almost too good. They could keep any vehicle running as long as they wanted to. They were an excellent maintenance group, and because of that, they liked fixing things and they kept fixing things. But by putting together the optioneering, explaining to everyone the process, it was critical in developing this plan, proving out why we wanted this and this decision framework in the SAMP to get it approved. And the pickup trucks is something that is emotional and was a surprisingly large cost item. We were able to get a win there that everyone could see. In the first year, replacing the first 80 pickup trucks, we're already able to show a annualized cost reduction in OPEX, and that OPEX reduction was greater than the depreciation and CapEx increase, to show that this is a system that works, asset management works, lifecycle management works, which was a very important first step for us all in this first phase. And then we started our process mapping. Let's see, I think I just saw a question pop in.
Yeah, maybe we'll
We'll
let Bodwin moderate and Tom moderate the questions, and we'll pause and take a few.
Okay.
Keep going.
All right, so that was our first kind of, let's call phase one, the half-year kickoff. Year one full-time work was what was in phase two. Phase three was year two. And we started looking at now taking that pickup truck model of let's make a decision more than just on the immediate financial. Let's look at the overall environmental. And we came up in the new capital project priority framework and we detailed what the 10 measurement criteria high level would be as part of the SAMP. But then implementing that was, after the SAMP was written, we said, we care about the short-term ROI, the long-term ROI. We care about the impact to our neighbors. We care about the aesthetics for our employees. We care about the safety of our employees. We came up with what those 10 criteria would be as part of the SAMP. Now, taking those criteria, figuring out how to use them, using the test case of the pickup trucks, we spent a long time developing a weighting criteria of those 10 and implementing then those 10 criteria in a new capital project prioritization framework for all of our capital asset decision making. So if we're buying new equipment, if we're looking at buying new land, we're scoring them against the same 10 that were developed in the SAMP. The SAMP on their own, delineating the 10, didn't implement them. This was then taking it to the next level to implement. Also in the SAMP, we talked about mature life cycle, figuring out when to maintain, when to replace. So the maintenance roadmap was taking the SAMP objectives and figuring out how our maintenance team could help implement them. They needed to have better data capture, better decision frameworks, and even a slight organizational change to be able to not just repair everything. As I said, they are excellent mechanics, and talking to peers who run shops at other areas, these guys are some of the best in the business. And it was almost to a fault. They were so good, they repaired everything when you don't necessarily want to put a new transmission in a pickup truck with 500,000 miles and rusted out floorboards. So the maintenance roadmap allowed us to start making those better decisions. We then went into our next two asset classes. As I said, we're going up to the longer and longer life, kind of adding chapters of asset management plans behind the strategic asset management plan as we work our way through each asset class. In this, we also added a new case study in the asset management plan. And in the strategic asset management plan, one of our strategic objectives is to right-size our fleets. So to right-size our fleet, one of the first ones we looked at and did an in-depth analysis is our hustler fleet. Hustlers have many names within our industry and others. They're called yard tractors, UTRs, yard mules, yard jockeys. They're basically the cab of a 18-wheeler or a tractor trailer, but they're a smaller version that is not for use over the road. It's just for within the terminal. So they don't have all the road safety equipment. They're not as powerful. They only get up to about 20 miles an hour. But hustlers, we have almost 200 in our fleet. They do a lot of the horizontal movement within. So this wasn't just looking at what the optimum life cycle is. This isn't just looking at which option best meets our capital prioritization, but is also looking at how many we need based off of different reliability and availability numbers, what the cost of having a few extra that are less reliable would be in capital and in maintenance. So doing an overall hustler life fleet size planning, including Monte Carlo assessments of what general volume changes could be. Of course, through COVID downturn followed by rapid cargo and logistics surge, our assumptions of the most optimistic case of growth, we were blown out of the water by more than double the growth rate, where we thought, thinking 8 to 10% growth would be extreme. The port actually saw 25% growth last year. But that framework did allow us to very quickly go back and assess what the needs would be, considering what we said before, what has changed. Since we had the asset management plan, the strategic asset management plan, and sustainability was one of our objectives. When the port got a new CEO, which we'll touch a little bit more depth on in a few more slides, but he came in and one of his new strategies and something he brought on as a focus for us, taking the sustainability from a side topic to one of our strategic objectives, is we need to figure out how we can get the port to be carbon zero. Several of our main customers are looking to do so themselves. We want to show that we are a good partner and go along with them. It's also the right moral thing to do. Sustainability has always been one of our core values, but this says we're going to make this our primary objective. We're going to do it because it's the right thing, and we're going to do it because it is, the capitalist thing to do because our customers demand it. With a good asset management plan, we were able to roll the carbon zero into that strategic asset management plan and start fitting that into our defined equipment lifecycle updates. Instead of saying, we're just going to go do it, and this was the topic of our chief operating officer in January, because we had an asset management plan, our strategy for decarbonization was real. As we've talked to some of our peers at some of the big retail stores, I'm not going to name names, but big retail stores that are in places like Bentonville, Arkansas, they had a plan. They were told to do it, but they didn't actually know how they were going to. It was just, we're going to do it. When we rolled out and started telling the market we're going to do it, we said, we have our asset management plan, we have our master plan, and the asset management plan now shows where we were going to life cycle replace all of our equipment, where we're going to replace it to carbon zero, how much more it may cost to go carbon neutral, but how that all already works into our plans. So we were able to say, because we have a mature asset management system, this isn't just a pipe dream. We're not just putting a windmill off on the horizon. We are actually have a set of clear steps that you can hold us to every year over the next few years to demonstrate we are getting to carbon zero, not just a tagline that we're sending out there. And then year 3, so kind of phase 4, we took the next step. We finished off all of our asset management plans under the strategic asset management plan. So our ship-to-shore cranes are very large cranes that go over the ships and unload the ships. Our civil infrastructure, so our asphalt, our piping, our electricity, and our building, and then our buildings. So we did 3 this year. We also took everything we learned since we had gone through and looked in detail at each of our asset management plans. We had a assessment of the current state of every class of assets. We rolled those all up into a state of the assets dashboard in Power BI, which Blair's team was able to put together a very nice, clean cut, executive view, vice president's view, terminal maintenance view of what we believe we have everywhere. We're also able to, because of some of the Excel underneath, I can tell it, okay, it's now 2 years in the future. If we don't do any replacements, what does that look like? How many assets are going to go to red because of what we expect in machine hours or just, years of life going forward? We're also looking at, we take a solid state capture of what this looks like today. So under our strategic asset management plan, we know we want to get to a replacement before failure for a lot of our items. Some are replaced at failure. But now we'll be able to look back in 3 years. Where were we in 2022? And did we actually burn down our backlog like we said we would? So we'll now be able to put, and it's going to be put in personally in my objectives over the next few years at the port, to demonstrate that we have been burning down our backlog towards per the plan. And the state of the assets dashboard is that summary that allows me to take a snapshot of that every year and show that we are burning down that backlog. So it'll also then be a great testimonial to the improvement that having a strategic asset management plan, not just a written document, but an actual plan that we're executing, will go. We also tweaked after 2 years and 2 capital cycles of using our of the new capital prioritization framework. We did a further tweak of that to better incorporate lessons learned, better tie in the feedback loop, and tweak some of the forms so that they were easier to use and to keep going. So it's been a pretty busy 3 years since I took over, but as I said, first lesson learned was you need someone to take over or it won't happen. And then we've just been pounding away, trying to get a lot done and proving out that having it helped us with the greenhouse gas and has allowed us to already start setting up a new measurement framework going forward because we have the strategic asset management plan.
Yep. Thanks, Dan, for that overview of everything you and your team have accomplished. Just want to bring out a couple central points here. First, around the asset management program, and then the carbon zero strategy. Basically, that asset management, or it wasn't until or when KPMG showed up. That's not when asset management started at the port. There were plenty of people like Dan and others that are exceptional in their jobs, and we're doing strong asset management. However, they hadn't been as deliberate as they could have been. And the first step was having Dan take the reins of the asset management program, and we'll tell you more about the framework. So being deliberate and capitalizing on the human capital and the efforts thus far was a general key step. And the same for the carbon zero strategy. So as we quantified as part of the carbon zero strategy, showing the glide path to carbon zero, we showed the significant GHG reductions that the port's made over the last 5 years. So they've been investing in transitioning from diesel cranes to electric cranes, and basically from general assets that have scope 1 emissions, and eliminating scope 1 emissions, and reducing scope 2 emissions as well. So the port was already thinking about this and taking steps, but through codifying this with a strategy, they are now deliberate, and they have something to guide their progress.
Would this be a good moment to maybe address the first 2 questions, which are very much tied into what has been explained today? So the first question was from Justin. How do you compare, or how does a SAMP differ from a master plan, or is it just a matter of rewording one for the other?
So it was actually when I talked about realizing the importance of asset management and getting it to start, that happened while I was working on the master plan. So from the port's perspective, previously I had been the vice president of analytics, and under me was financial planning and analytics. They had just finished the financial planning and analytics team had just finished leading the budget, and then the CFO came and said, "Listen, our bond rating agencies require a master plan update." And my team was exhausted. I couldn't in good conscience tell them they needed another 2-month project. So I wound up taking on the master plan update myself. And in doing that, we have to, by our bond covenants, have to do a master plan for the age of our bonds. So that meant about 45 years of financial plan that we could show we had a financial plan and an investment and reinvestment plan over the course of that period. In doing that, I realized even though we were planning to expand to 2 new facilities and more than double our footprint, still half of our capital needed to be in just life cycle updates. And realizing that we had no plan for those life cycle updates is what made me say, all right, this asset management needs to happen. We need a plan for that. So we had a master plan, which was primarily a financial model and a financial document that could go to our bondholders, that our board would know that management had responsibly put together a plan. It had just rough ideas of you replace everything at its depreciation life cycle. It wasn't at what's the actual responsible life cycle, because some things we want to replace sooner than that. Some things you can take longer than that, though. Because we are a semi-governmental agency, we tried to actually our depreciation straight line, and we tried to set it at a realistic life cycle, not a accelerated depreciation for tax purposes. So for us, the master plan had that, but it was purely the financial model. There wasn't anything that said each year when it was time to make budget, we didn't look at that to say what was our plan for this year. That was just generally there to make sure we could afford our bonds and our replacements. This asset management plan then was actually what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And that has since led to updates in the master plan. So I think of the strategic asset management plan is the overall strategy for how we're going to handle our assets. The master plan is an operations plan because we need to know what our operational cash flow would be. And it needs to then be the consolidated financial model for how we are going to afford to execute the strategic asset management plan.
Yep. Actually, it ties in nicely with a question that Renee just entered here. Isn't it important to first have a policy in place before you develop your SAMP? So did you have a policy in place, asset management policy in place, and did it come from the top?
Sure. So the asset management principles is essentially the asset management policy. It's just a policy as a unique implication at the port. But you're absolutely right, Renee, that before we started into the SAMP or anything else, we worked to develop those asset management principles or asset management policy, which, as Dan spoke to earlier, we're just translating the organization's mission and objectives and strategic goals into policy and principles and how they'll manage their assets.
Rightio. And then Joe had this question, which I think is partly answered by the timeline that you mentioned there. That is, how often is the SAMP revisited or updated? So I guess your SAMP 2.0 came 2 years after the first one. Is that the way I interpret?
You're good follow there. Every 2 years are the intervals for updating the SAMP. That's correct.
And also with that, it got put into some of our actual policies. So now our ISO 9001 auditor every other year is going to check to make sure that I have an updated SAMP, or she will be penalizing me on my ISO 9001 audit. So it is not just something that we were planning to do. It has become a must do.
All right. Well, that answers Joe's other question, which is what drives an update. So
incentives.
clearly it's the big stick.
Yeah.
All right.
But that
Well,
also makes sure that I get the resources I need every 2 years to ensure it gets updated with the right thought, which is important. Not just that I have that stick making me do it, but I can also then use that to make sure I have my peers and everyone motivated to help me.
all right. Back over to you.
All right. So getting into the port SAMP. So the high level objectives for the port SAMP is to drive and frame asset management discussions across the port. And primary to that is to define value. So the illustration here essentially is the value chain at the Port of Virginia. So all the assets that the port has that sit between a ship coming in to pick up or drop off cargo to the trucks and the trains that bring it in and out of the port, all those assets exist to move cargo. All of the port's employees, their central mission is to be a part of cogs in the machine for efficient throughput of cargo at the port. And the goal is for safe, cheap, and quick throughput of cargo in the port. So that is a driving force for the port's asset management program and a central theme in the SAMP. What the SAMP is done for the port, and I wish I was as clever as the folks that will be presenting next week to borrow the cliche of it being the destination being the journey. That's essentially what it is at the Port of Virginia. The development of the SAMP and the maintenance of the SAMP um, drives the conversation, and the SAMP is where those outcomes and the strategy is codified. And we'll talk about more about the framework and the individuals and folks that are part of those discussions. But it's really the driving force for the discussions and, like I said, to codify the outcomes and the plans that come out of those discussions. It's intended to be an executive level document. So each chapter has its own topic. It could, in theory, be pulled out and presented to executives, to the board, or other groups within the port or stakeholders. So it's the intent is to make it easy to digest and have the appropriate level of detail, and understand that there are other documents that kind of fit into the asset management system at the port. And it's an opportunity to achieve buy-in. So as Dan will eventually speak to, it's an opportunity to gather folks throughout the port, all the stakeholders when it comes to asset management, and to document key information to leadership and achieve consensus with the goal. One of the goals of the SAMP being to achieve buy-in, especially across the upper echelons of leadership, to get that line of sight, which is crucial for successful asset management. So some of the, as we see it, the key differentiators is an emphasis on succinctness. I have to admit that I've been guilty of writing SAMPs or asset management plans that when printing them killed quite a few trees. Tried to move away from that and have a succinct document that, like I said, is accessible for busy individuals, for executives to get the information that they need and not get bogged down, not have a document that is just too detailed and not accessible to folks. It needs to be, succinct and brief, but also we went to great lengths to avoid nomenclature, acronyms, etc. So essentially, somebody who isn't sitting in these asset management discussions, isn't in the asset management working group at the port, can pick it up, and they don't need a translation. They don't need somebody to coach them through reading it. We have a general emphasis on graphics and data visualizations. So the MO for us was to where we can use a graphic or a visualization to use that in lieu of text, and that feeds into making it an accessible, digestible document. And essentially, it's a detailed presentation format. So that means that it's in PowerPoint. It's not in Word, which has its positives and drawbacks, but generally makes it more accessible. We went to great lengths to make sure that we captured the right amount of detail in the SAMP, and we'll talk through kind of the various documents where when it comes to asset management plans, SAMP, asset management principles or policy, et cetera, where the SAMP fits in. But the idea wasn't to cram every last bit of information in the SAMP. It's to make it a high level document and let folks know that where they want to dig in further, that there are other documents that cover that ground. Back to Dan to talk about the asset management structures or framework at the port.
All right, so kind of just going through, it's probably useful to know our organization and what the titles and levels mean. So we have a CEO and executive director who's the overall lead. Beneath him are 6 chiefs, and then below them, such as myself, are vice presidents. So the vice president is, skip level to the CEO. Right now, our asset management working group is primarily the vice president level, as well as our chief financial officer. Which I think I mentioned, talk a little bit about coming up, but the port got a new CEO and executive director in March of 2021. When he came on board, he actually wanted asset management to get even a little higher focus than it had had. So he had the chief financial officer join the asset management working group. So it was primarily vice president level. Then I actually now report through the chief operating officer. At the time, I was under the chief of innovation, which was, under innovation was things like analytics, IT, marketing, just a couple different areas. But the CEO wanted it to asset management to have more of a focus and be well tied in. So he actually added the chief financial officer to our working group. Other VP level in here includes our head of maintenance. So we have about $120 million a year in maintenance budget, fixing all the equipment. Our vice president of operations, both the vice president of maintenance and operations also report to the chief operating officer. We have our chief engineer and chief information officer. Despite chief in their name, they're actually VP levels under kind of our chief technology. And we have our vice president of government affairs. She is under our chief public affairs officer, but government affairs under her is the person who goes to the state, it gets grants for us, federal grants, state grants, asks for state money. So all of that kind of mid and long-term financial coordination, though we do a lot of it with the chief financial officer under our own money and the money we generate from operations. We also do include grants. We make sure that our improvements aren't going to impact the roadways and railways outside of our facilities. So our chief of government affairs also helps quite a bit with that, coordinating our long-term plans. If we are planning under asset management to need a new facility 10 years from now, she needs to start working with the state to make sure we have roads going to that facility that can handle the truck traffic. So making sure asset management, and this is kind of also some of the tie into master plan, but the asset management plans of the master plan says we'll need new capacity. The master plan says we'll need new capacity. The asset management plan says, here's where we plan to purchase what equipment. Here's where we plan to have what type of facility, which then allows our vice president of government affairs, since she is incorporated in this body, to know when to go make sure the state has roads there. The last is our vice president of business transformation. So he runs process excellence. So, under him is our ISO 9001. The overall analytics group has since been split up once I moved to asset management, but the kind of data warehousing and reporting is still under him. A separate kind of surge analytics support is under him, as well as some of our inventory and warehousing, which is making sure we have the right parts and our warehouse knows what parts we're going to need, ties very much into our asset management plan. If we're planning to replace all of the 2008 trucks, he needs to know not to have any to start winnowing down parts for the 2008 trucks in his warehouse. We have unfortunately, without that tie-in in the past, this was another one of our wins from the asset management program. We've had a series of very large write-downs in inventory where we had a lot of parts for equipment we don't own anymore. So now making sure our asset management working group includes the vice president over the warehousing helps tie in some of that. That's kind of the right half. On the left half, so our senior leadership team, because they are over top of these vice presidents, have some direct control. But as much as possible, our senior leaders have delegated to the asset management working group and myself the authority to make these plans. We don't go mother may I at each step. Pretty much now that we have done the update of the SAMP, we're going back as a roadshow to the rest of the chiefs saying, these are the updates we have done. This is what it is going to be, more as a, make you aware, because we on the asset management working group have been delegated the authority to make those decisions. Of course, everybody is keeping their bosses in the loop over the course of the year and the update. Hopefully it is not a surprise to any chief what their vice president has made as the decision. So that is kind of the way we are working right now. Another important note from that thought bubble is GIS sits within the asset management department. So we have, this year, since the asset management started looking at the civil infrastructure and buildings, as that happened, we had an existing GIS program, but because the civil assets and building assets are now a key part of the asset management plans, we rolled GIS into the asset management department. So our GIS manager reports directly to me, as well as then the financing for the consulting contracts who do some of the more grunt work, the people who go out and do surveys and assessments to ensure our GIS is up to date, to do some of the as-built assessments to update GIS for civil and building assets. So that is now within us. A lot of ports, their asset management is purely on the civil and building that are landlord ports. We are a little unique because we are an owner operator. So the landlord activities are important to us, but as is the actual equipment and the use of the equipment. So we have the full breadth where a lot of ports are either only looking at the equipment or only looking at the civil. We'll then set up some task teams under the asset management working group. So when we went to look at our ship-to-shore cranes, we pulled in the manager of maintenance for ship-to-shore cranes at each of the two primary locations. We brought in our stevedoring managers, actually brought in the lower level managers who work directly with it there. We thought it was useful to have each level of the company participate in that task team. We had our overall berth scheduling manager, the director for our marine operations, as well as then two entry-level marine assistant managers in the task team, helping us with the ship-to-shore crane asset management plan. So as we do that, that was one of those task teams for the initiative. And then, every month at the asset management working group, where decisions needed to be made on that asset management plan, they came back to the asset management working group to make the decisions. But just as our senior leaders, purposely delegated some authority down to the asset management working group, to the most part, we tried to delegate as much from the working group to those task teams, including some of the younger management, to say what is actually needed. Within the framework of what the strategic asset management plan is, they were all given that ahead of time. These are our objectives. This is what we're trying to do. We would like, here are the existing asset management plans. We're developing this. Now, Blair was there helping, meet with those task teams at least monthly, sometimes twice monthly, to keep them and help, I'm blanking on the word, but help moderate their discussions to make sure that they were productive and, staying on target, so that we could then generate the, asset management plan for that specific item. So that is kind of how we worked, how we took the strategic asset management plan, tried to get buy-in at different levels, but also then incorporate as much of the lower level and mid-level knowledge into the asset management plan under the strategic asset management plan, where we had the oversight of some of our senior, our vice president level, as well as our top senior leadership group. And then our board of commissioners meets every other month. And over the last 3 years, I have briefed them at least annually. I'm on the agenda in July, and that'll be over 3 years, the 7th time I've been asked to present some of what we have done to the Board of Commissioners. So that has been, one was, the reason it's not 6 and it is 7 over the 3 years is I had a bonus brief on how the greenhouse gas project rolled into our asset management. So it has been something that our Board of Commissioners knows about in detail, our senior leadership is into, and as I said, with our new CEO putting the emphasis on making our chief financial officer join it is something that he realizes is a very key part of the strategy of the business.
Yep. Dan's going to tell you more about the asset management working group and the role that they play, but just want to underscore what he said about that group meeting monthly. So each asset management working group meeting starts with a progress report, where that group is keeping Dan and the KPMG team accountable for progressing all these initiatives. So that asset management journey, without that structure in place of the asset management working group to make sure that that's moving along, I'm not sure if we would have accomplished all of that. And an additional benefit that's helped to accomplish all of that is to having that consistency to meet monthly. So it's the first Thursday of each month. It's blocked off for 12 months in the calendar, and there's that expectation that folks are gonna show up and be actively participating. So it took some cajoling to get these busy folks to commit that time, but the port is seeing the benefits of it.
And just to kind of a little bit of color on that, in my goals that are tied to whether or not I get a bonus, I needed to maintain greater than 80% attendance throughout the last 2 years. So some of it is, I've been able to use that to, cajole some of the people like, come on, dude, if you don't come, it's going to cost me money. Please, we need everybody there. But we have actually maintained close to 95% average attendance over the 2 years. So it has been very, very good.
So is that based on the quality of the donuts that you serve at the meeting, or what's the incentive?
The first year we did include lunch almost every time, but we want to respect people's time, so we actually start at 1 o'clock, so it's after lunch now. But people are still willing to come without the incentive of me ordering sandwiches. So, but the first year and getting the momentum, it definitely did take sandwiches and cookie trays.
So
yeah, that set up that Pavlovian response.
There you go. So there's a question which ties into the structure that you just we were looking at the previous slide there, and that's can you talk more about the business analyst support role and what they do?
Yeah. So the business analyst support is someone who, out of the financial planning and analytics, who can do the net present costs, net present values, that sort of analysis. And that role. And then they'll also work with the data team. Just like if we have a question of, go through the databases, how many machines actually move containers on any given day, going back through a lot of, I don't like to say big data that we have, though we have some very large databases. It's still all of our structured database tables, but go through the medium data and get the information that the working group needs. There's a lot of information that needs to be consolidated out of the databases and the history. to be able to make the decision. So that business analyst is the one we go to say, hey, we have this question, please get us the data or the information. Go through the data, get us some information so that we can make a informed decision.
Right. You mentioned the Board of Commissioners and the fact you reported back to them. It may tie into one of the questions that we had here. Is there any financial confirmation about the results after executing the SAMP? So in other words, do you tie it back into, I guess, the level of achievements of the SAMP? Is that monetized?
So to some extent, yes. Now, things like I mentioned, our pickup trucks, where that was almost very low hanging fruit, but we were able to demonstrate very quickly direct cost savings and a net present cost savings. A lot of our other items are 10 and 12-year assets in the middle group, and then 40 and 50-year assets in the older group. So it's going to take a little bit of time to be able to show the direct financial savings, but we do have a lot of data capture in place now to start showing that.
And conversely, does the asset management team manage the port capital and operating budgets, since you make all the decisions on what projects are developed and executed?
So we do and help manage the life cycle update budget. Separately, if there are decisions to enter new markets, to make major changes, that is then sort of outside of asset management. Our plan is for considering expected growth and sustainment of the business as it is. That is within the scope of asset management. There's quite a bit that we're looking at that are changes in our business, whether it's going after a tangential new customer or other areas. That's kind of outside of our scope, how those decisions are made. So that is then not within asset management purview. So life cycle capital, actually our CEO from his previous world, he was CEO of another port where he was owned by a equity group. He always refers to capital maintenance as opposed to life cycle. We had always been calling it, life cycle planning. He calls it capital maintenance. And so that capital maintenance, life cycle updates, large overhauls is the purview of asset management. And we kind of get the first cut at available money in the capital budget. Once we say what is needed for the life cycle and the maintaining of good order, then what are the new projects? Where do we want to grow? What tangential is there? That's then a separate, but though they use our decision model for the capital decisions, that is kind of made outside of the asset management working group.
Yeah, probably worth mentioning, Dan, what you talked a bit about earlier, your capital project evaluation. So the port set up a structure. It's about 10 criteria that they evaluate projects on: short, long-term ROI, safety, sustainability, etc. And they consider costs, and the output of that is a ranking of projects that gets handed over, and as part of that decision on what gets delivered and what has to wait. But like Dan said, the asset management team is a part of that discussion, but the ultimate decision making lies at the top echelons at the organization.
As speaking of the top echelons, Tom Smith has a question, so we should immediately defer to him and ask him to jump in.
Yeah, I was very interested in your comment about new ventures and new business being slightly outside of asset management. So do they come and ask you about capabilities? Do you talk about, do you use the word capability, and do you talk about that? And do the people who have dreams of doing new things get your advice on whether or not it's practical?
Not directly. I mean, on some areas, yes, like, do we have the sufficient equipment to handle this as is? What are the timelines to get this? Can we support, we need to borrow this equipment for 6 months for this special project. Can that be done? Do we need to buy more? Do we have things that we could repurpose? In that area, they do, but I'm not the expert on how our operations work. So that, sometimes there'll be discussions in the overall asset management working group if there needs to be some trade-offs made, especially since it is one of the only forums in the company where, the IT department, operations, maintenance, the chief engineer representing civil are all sitting around the table having a discussion where we've built rapport over 3 years of doing this quite a bit. Sometimes it can become that just because it is such a good forum, but it is, I actually try to keep us out of that. I think if we try to get into every decision and constantly increase our scope, it will make it harder to focus on what needs to be our primary objective of, the life cycle of our assets. And until we get really good at that, which we're not there yet, I like to keep us focused on the primary objective.
So somebody had the bright idea that you ought to go into bulk cargo, take grain from the Midwest or whatever and ship it east. You'd stay out of that for the time being.
I would try to. Sometimes we help moderate some of those discussions, and try to, because we have the good framework for decision making in a way that's been developed for asset management, we can use that to help inform the decisions that they are being made in other areas. And we can help, make sure the right people are informed, especially if someone says, hey, we're buying, since I'm in all the capital decisions, I can say, okay, if you want to buy that, you have to make sure I'm informed so I know to plan in 10 years to replace it. But that also then allows me to make sure, everyone is informed and loops are closed. So, but yes, in general, I try to stay out of it, because if you get to, every organization has a little bit of internal politics. If I get into too many of those politics, it'll make it very hard to get what needs to get done in continuing to mature asset management.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
So maybe one little terminology question, and then I'll let you guys continue. That is, what was the objective of naming the assets management working group a working group, since it looks more like a leadership group?
I think if we try to have, they're making most of the decisions. So in those monthly briefs, we're going through and trying to decide what we're going to do. We have given homework and writing assignments to the vice presidents and all in different areas. The amount of work, like when we were going through the IT asset management plan, I was probably taking a day a week of the CIO's time to go through what we needed to do, have him write areas, have him schedule meetings and work with his directors and his managers, to even figure out, how many servers he had. So they have to, and I think that's key. We're not just asking them to come into the meeting each month. There is work that they need to do above and beyond the meeting.
Awesome.
Dan, you want to cover any of these items that we haven't covered yet, as far as what the asset management working group does?
I don't know. Sorry, I kind of cut you off while you were in the middle of bullet 3. So is there anything else you were going to cover? Oh, I think actually, as answering the questions, we went through the rest of these.
Okay. So I think now we can get to probably what folks are most interested in, and now in the second round, after 2 years of developing the first SAMP, the benefits that the port has realized from its strategic asset management plan.
So the strategy, as I said, we got a new CEO in February, March of 21. Having the strategy really assisted his transition. So he came around, met with different groups throughout the organization. And when he came to meet with the innovation department, he had questions for everybody within it. And for asset management, he basically, his initial conversation with me was under a minute. He had so much to learn, but when he said, wait, we have a strategy, you actually have a framework for decision making. Oh, that's a big relief. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that. I will read it when I have to start making, signing off on capital things. But it made it much simpler to onboard a new leader, knowing that we had a policy, or the principles into policy. We had the strategic asset management plan in place. It was not something he had to worry about, that we were mature, that he could trust the decisions coming forward, which made it very easy for us to bring in the new CEO and keep some of our capital processes a lot more stable. Some of the other areas got a lot bigger update with a new CEO and a new leadership style than the capital side got, because we had the codified strategy in the strategic asset management plan. And it's not just the CEO, other staff. We brought in several new engineers this year. So then looking at the civil plan, being able to talk to me about it, really helped them understand what their project frameworks were, what they had. Also with the GIS, they're able to then see where everything is. It makes it much quicker to orient the new staff. We just had a update in our maintenance department, which included bringing in a new director for maintenance training and coordination of training and training center for maintenance. So him seeing when we plant, how far along we need to train, what we need to start training our maintenance team on for what is, when to say, hey, I don't think we should fix this one. This is getting near to replacement, and helping him build into his training environment the asset management strategy, or the strategic asset management plan. Made it much easier to onboard him, and then to let him know some of what he needed to train. As I said, having our asset management plan allowed us to structure the execution of decarbonization. Decarbonization, for those who don't know, you basically break your carbon output into 3 scopes. Scope 1 is your tailpipes. Scope 2 is your energy sources, like where your electricity comes from. Scope 3 is your supply chain. So scope 1, since within our strategic asset management plan, is the life cycle of all of our equipment that has engines. It was very natural to say, how are we going to update those life cycles such that we can make sure we eliminate all of our engines and tailpipes between now and 2040? So we had the structure. It was a very easy update. And we could then inform we talked about the tie back into master plan. In the next update of the master plan, we can go back and look at those life cycle and say, where we plan to replace trucks with a $20,000 truck with a new $20,000 truck, we can now say those are electric trucks and they cost 30 grand. But we're going to take a little off of our energy budget in the operations expense, because fueling them under a power purchase agreement with a fixed energy cost is cheaper than gasoline going forward.
Dan, if I may interject, I just want to give a tangible example of how that played out. We took some of the folks on the asset management working group and some of their staff and sat in a room and looked down the asset base and did an outlook of where the technology was as far as eliminating scope 1 emissions. And we had a view on each asset group, whether it was that technology was at market, if it was bleeding edge, if it was 1 generation away or 2 generations away. And that feeds in to the asset management planning, knowing that some of these assets where you have a quick turnaround, you have more runway for that technology to catch up. Some of the other assets that are going to be around for a while, Port understands, when they need to make a decision and maybe look into some technology that's maybe bleeding edge, or think about their investments. So it's really having that asset management structure in place help them develop the strategy, and it's helping them execute it.
I think that's a very important highlight there. And even with that, it, as I said, our government affairs vice president on the working group, as we have those discussions, it also allows her to know very clearly, where we are, where we may need bleeding edge technology. That's usually the best thing to go for grants. we want to help, and that's the purpose of a lot of the grants. Let's help stimulate the engineering. We know this isn't cost affordable for kind of generation zero. So by having the woman who's connected to the grant agencies on our asset management working group, she's able to, now that decarb is part of it, really be able to take that information to some of the decision makers in the grant giving agencies, both at our state level as well as at the federal level, and explain to them, if you want to decarb ports, these are big carbon emitters that there is no good technology. If you want, groups of ports to help invest in stimulating the engineering for the prototypes, they're not going to do it under their own current economic situation. This is where you should inject the grant money to help stimulate and speed up the technology development. So it's a very important having the diverse working group, but also having then that plan there. Yeah, and then we have a huge surge in volume right now, and there's a lot of debates of, we will hope to keep it all as the post-COVID surge goes down. But, trying to have the framework to say, what are we going to do if the surge continues? What are we going to do if it is just a big wave and catch up? So that we have a framework and data in place to make sure that we make the right decisions. And so some things we have said, okay, in case this is just a surge, instead of retiring some of the old equipment that we got, life cycle we had planned to replace this year, we got the replacements in, but we're going to, instead of it in the long term normal case, the lowest net present cost would be to retire some of this equipment that's old instead of continuing to repair. Right now, we're going to continue to repair some of this as opposed to disposing it because we need the equipment surge now. And we want to wait to make sure we understand what the market is really going to look like in 2 years. Instead of buying a $1.5 million crane that's going to last 12 years that we might not need in 3, let's see if we can keep the current ones alive a little bit longer. We can take to our leadership that decision framework of here's what the risk analysis looks like of if the volume does stay, we wasted a little bit of money in net present cost this year by continuing to repair. But if it doesn't stay, here's how much money we saved by not over investing in our capital. And if in a year from now, the volume's still here, the economic scenario looks like it's going to stay, we can put in a larger purchase instead of just life cycling, 1/10, we'll do it 2/10, and we'll buy extra next year to plus up our equipment inventory to catch up. But it allows us, we've been looking at not just the direct cost, but some of that risk cost of what's the risk of over purchasing our capital, and is that risk of over purchasing capital greater or less than the added cost of maintaining things past what might be optimum life cycle. So having the framework has been good for the historic surge. And then, as I talk about we talked about some of the future, having the frameworks allows, this is outside of the asset management directly scope, but having the asset management framework when different groups look at long-term strategy to be able to score and understand how their long-term strategy decisions are playing out. We can use the asset management framework, use the capital framework that asset management developed to score those strategic whiteboarding sessions. So even though it's outside of asset management, I'm not going to influence their decision. Our tools give them that clear framework of what the priorities are to look at the long-term strategy, which will then, if they change the strategy, it's kind of separate that I still own the master plan. There's kind of some discussion of how much that should be master plan, how much master plan should be under asset management, or just asset management should feed into it. Right now, I still own the master plan, mostly because of just organizational momentum. But it does allow me to, use the strategy as a separate group. Then the asset management working group is meeting to discuss strategy. We can use the products of the working group to inform their decision making, to help score their different scenarios, and then when they make decisions, implement those into the master plan, the financial side.
Dan, that kind of triggers a question. You have the word de-emotionalizing there in italics. So I guess that ties into what you were just describing of scoring, which brings us back to at the very beginning, you mentioned the 10 famous criteria. So I guess that's the expression of value for the organization, goes through those 10 criteria. Do you actually monetize those? So is everything turned back into dollars, or how does that work?
No, we had a lot of discussions over whether or not we would do that. And in the end, we decided not to. Some of it is like when one of our scores is safety, nobody wants to put their name on paper of actually putting a dollar value to levels of safety. You're going to, because if not, it gets very hard. If you're an insurance company and you have some actuarians, you can put a legit dollar value on safety. But because it gets a little tricky, we didn't want to necessarily put anything down on dollar valuing safety. Or one of ours is the impact on our neighbors. That's another thing that, we don't really want a newspaper to stumble across the dollar value we put on the, how well our neighbors sleep at night. So we have decided that, one, the amount of work it would take to actually put dollar values on that, and then the amount of work it would take to score every project and turn every project's environmental, safety, neighbor impact into a dollar value to be equally scored was a little bit too much to chew off. So keeping those at semi-subjective, but trying to use a clear and consistent framework, we thought was a lot better for our organization. But there was a lot of debate, and one of the former chiefs in our port was very big on trying to get us to that level of maturity. My answer always was, because I was worried about more the political side, but it was always, let us get to this level of maturity, and that's going to be on our future roadmap for, that gives us areas for the constant improvement, new levels of maturity in the future. But it is politically risky as well as just very, very difficult. So we've decided to stay with subjective. And subjective isn't the right word. They are very, we try to have objective, codified, and
but it's not in dollar value.
Yeah, and where possible objective, how many people safety does this impact? Is this actively causing injuries, or is this just a risk of injuries? Is this something that happens, monthly, weekly, annually, so that we have buckets so that it is a consistent scoring and not purely subjective, but also not objectively tied back to a dollar.
Yeah, what I see quite often is organizations develop an internal currency, which is not a dollar, but it looks like a dollar. So it smells like a dollar.
Yeah.
So, but it's used internally.
But you could almost say that that's some of what we do on these scores, because they do come back with a overall score. But the score is then it's the score divided by dollars. So we're looking at, each project's impact score over the cost. So how much impact are you getting per dollar spent? And sometimes some things people really want to fight for, but when you're like, listen, your score is a 12 and the cutoff this year is a 15. Like, can you demonstrate that we misscored anything? No? All right. Sorry, we just don't have funds to do everything. And it really does, it de-emotionalizes. And we tried to make the scores, as I said, they're not dollar values, but we tried to make them as objective as possible.
Excellent.
Maybe one final point, and then maybe we can open up to broader questions. Just want to bring it back to the asset management system at the port and where the SAMP fits in. So you can see there are kind of 5 primary areas that comprise the asset management system at the Port of Virginia, starting these are in a circle, so no, doesn't denote the importance. To Renee's earlier point, it starts with the principles of asset management or the asset management policy, then the asset management governance framework, the asset management plans, the capital expenditure manual that Dan has spoken to, and that goes beyond the evaluations. It goes all the way through, the full governance of capital projects through delivery and closeout, and communications and stakeholder engagement plan. Realizing that we don't show the SAMP on here, but Dan actually has a physical binder that he's developed for his boss. That the first chapter is the asset management principles, then it's the strategic asset management plan, and sitting below that are the asset management plans. As we've spoken to earlier, we try to put the right level of detail in each of those documents and stay consistent with what everyone here in the IAM espouses.
Which begs the question, who actually owns the SAMP within your organization?
I don't know if you would say I would or the asset management working group, because they're the ones, that everyone agrees to it. I meet with each member of the asset management working group with their chief to go through and make sure that they feel we didn't step too far out of line. So I would say, I could probably pull it up, probably because of for the plan, as I said, our ISO auditor reviews it. So I'm sure for ISO documentation, it has an owner, which is probably me directly, but I try to make sure that the whole working group feels that they own it and feels that they are responsible for it.
So
Very
basically, it's in Dan's bonus, but he delegates the authority out.
Right. And actually, earlier on, Blair, you were talking, when you were describing the SAMP, you were talking about it as something that you were involved, or I guess you were using we. So I assume that it means that KPMG was involved in the production thereof. So is it something which is a joint effort between KPMG and the port itself, or is it something that over time will migrate to the port?
Yeah, so basically everything that we've shown in the asset management journey thus far, KPMG has supported the port on. But I think at this point, built up the human capital enough at the port where they can start to walk on their own. I know that there will be initiatives that will continue. KPMG is continuing to support the port on right now a maintenance strategy, and the plan is to leverage consultants to fill the gaps where that human capital isn't in house. But at this point in the journey, we got a really strong group that is ready to take the reins.
Awesome. Question from Monica, back to the scoring of projects. So does your scores take into account the criticality of proposed projects to the business area continuity of operations?
Yes, that is one of the criteria. So we have, one of the criteria is, I'm trying to think of the exact wording, but it's basically maintaining level of service. So without this, we will have a level of service degradation to that operation. And then in that, it then goes into questions of what is that, impact? Is this how? And that's when you basically score, for our customers, is this 1%, 5%, 10% of our customers who will be impacted? Is this going to be impact that, we're currently, like, one of our main customer level KPIs is how quickly a truck is able to come onto terminal, get rid of their container, get a new container, and leave again. So we try to say, okay, this is going to impact how quick we can turn a truck out, and that truck KPI. So trucks are 60% of our business, but this is only one location. So it's only 30% of our overall volume. And we want to maintain that continuity of operations. But we're currently beating our goal and beating the industry standard, where we want to be at 50 minutes for the average truck. We're currently at 35. So investing there to maintain the criticality is then scored lower on, are we failing? There's one on, are we currently failing to meet? Are we expecting to soon fail to meet? Or are we actually exceeding, but we're afraid we might in the future fail to meet? So we take that into account, and I believe maintaining level of service is our second highest rated criteria, even above the net present value. I think it goes safety and then is number one, and then maintaining level of service is number two.
Awesome. Dan, you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned 9,000, ISO 9001 twice. You didn't mention 55,001. So is that something that you're pursuing, or how do you kind of connect the two together?
I don't think we are going to pursue. Overall, the overall leadership culture right now, we don't necessarily want to go after additional standards in other areas, but we also don't want to lose any of the standards that we currently have. There have been a couple areas. 55,001 is one. There were two others, I don't remember which ones, that we were discussing potentially expanding our ISO certificates, but the organization decided not to. So we are 9,001 and 14,001. And both of those, so 14,001 is our environmental protection systems. Both of those we intend to maintain, but right now our overall corporate strategy is we are not going after additional ISO standards and certifications.
Excellent. Well, this is really the time for any last questions that the audience might have. It's now or never. We're coming towards the end. So feel free to shoot any questions that you have. You mentioned, Dan, you mentioned the 25% growth, which was over double what you had expected for the last 2 years, I guess. So that really kind of points towards dynamic SAMPs. Any ideas of really kind of making the future generations of the SAMP maybe, higher frequency, or how do you make them more dynamic, basically, to respond to those unexpected big shifts?
Well, I'm trying to keep the SAMP such that the SAMP is outlining what the strategy will be, considering the volumes and all. So things like the master plan need to change quite a bit more, and timeframes move up. But our strategy of, we're going to replace cranes, for when we replace cranes, for our strategy for what level of surplus equipment we want to have, just, whether it's for when things break, when PMs are, that strategy shouldn't change. So I don't think we would necessarily want to change the SAMP any more frequently, for we might get caught too much in the emotion of the time of the growth. But, some things like we want to maintain an asset base such that we have spare capacity in the strategic asset management plan is part of our strategy, something that needs to stay in our strategic asset management plan. But the execution of that, where all of a sudden we use that full 20% of our spare capacity, just informs that we now need a process to expand our capacity to meet it. But the strategy, I don't want to change, or else it becomes more a tactical plan as opposed to.
Yep.
So I would like to not change it too frequently, or else we might just get caught in the emotion of the moment.
Cool. Question from Etienne Malouin. Do you plan on making another maturity assessment at some point? And what do you aim as a fair maturity level over time for you as an organization?
That's an interesting question. That might be, especially like Blair said, we're going to try to walk on our own this year. That maybe after a year of that, maybe like, let's say year and a half of that, we're getting ready to do the next SAMP update. That might be the opportune time to do another assessment. As part of the assessment, it was, where would we like to go? Which of these areas are most important to us to achieve? How do we currently score ourselves against there? And what's a responsible plan to fill our gaps? We can't, we don't have infinite time or financial budget to, instantly get everything to as good as we'd like to be. So we need a multi-year plan. So it might be at the next update of the SAMP, new assessment might be the perfect thing to inform what we want to do in the strategy next.
Yeah,
That
and
is
that
a very good
assessment,
question
yeah.
and not something I had thought of yet. So thank you very much for that question. That's something I'm going to write down because that gave me a great idea. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for planting the seed for KPMG to come back and do another assessment. But yeah, I just want to kind of back up what Dan said. I mean, we did that maturity assessment. We're looking at the current state and the short, medium, and long-term goals, which are in our estimations are 1, 3, and 5 years. So if you were to do it a year and a half from now, you'd be at almost that 5-year, and you could grade yourself on how effective you were in meeting those goals, and then have another 5-year outlook.
Good. Tom, you had a question or a comment?
Question and a comment. Thanks very much. I've been really enjoying this discussion, and I have a lot of notes for a project that I'm working on. But I liked your comment about starting with the pickup trucks and working up to the civil. I find myself almost always involved in projects where people want to start with the biggest and work down to the smallest. But the idea of starting, let's bite off the biggest chunk because that's the most challenging. But actually getting the process right is the most challenging, and starting it with something manageable. And and I think we all know why people love their pickup trucks. So I mean, that's the perfect place to to start the work. So was that a hard sell? Did you have people who wanted to go big first and fix the train tracks and the piers and then worry about the pickups?
Not really. As I said, it was delegated to the working group, and we basically just said, this is what we are going to do, and this is the plan. I think it might have been under Blair and team's guidance that was the best way forward. I don't really remember how and when we made that decision, other than, that made sense for us. And we just kind of started that way. Blair, do you remember specifically? Was that just you saying that's the best way, or?
I think we heard anecdotes in the maturity assessment of how poor shape the pickup trucks were. So previous practice as a port, hope I'm not sharing any dirty laundry here, Dan, was to acquire secondhand pickups from the Virginia Department of Transportation. And some of them, they were free when they got handed over. But Dan talked to the maintenance price tag. So you had unhappy staff that were driving around in clunky pickups. You had a huge maintenance tag, and it was an opportunity to get a quick win. So we talked about achieving buy-in, having a plan with a positive ROI on a set of assets was our vision, where to start, and then to move to, kind of the more complex, higher dollar assets.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, we're at time, so I'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I'd like to quickly remind our audience that, of course, we want you all to be members of the IAM. There is multiple benefits. You can read them all on screen, and there's many chapters and branches around North America which you can join and share knowledge, as we heard today, and as we've seen today. Like, there's a lot to be shared and a lot to be learned. So I think from that point of view, the IAM is a wonderful platform. And with that in mind, we're meeting again next week for part 2 of this SAMP discussion. And for that, we'll be moving to Canada, and Tom, therefore, will be doing the honors since we've kind of mixed it up. And then a reminder, of course, that the Global Virtual Conference is coming up in mid-June. and even more importantly, the North American conference, which will be in person again this year, thankfully, will be up in October. So I hope to see you all there. And with that, I'd like to thank our speakers again, and I will see you next week.
Yes, there will be a recording for that question.
That is correct.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, everybody.
Perfect.
Bye-bye.